My wife Amy's betrayal was a nightmare come true. Her late nights were filled with secret affairs and shady deals. A private investigator unveiled a hidden world, covert meetings with criminals, participating in illegal activities, and shocking footage of Amy planning my downfall. She was not just cheating, she was living a dangerous double life. My rage and heartbreak were overwhelming as I uncovered the depths of her deceit. This is my journey through the darkest depths of betrayal, seeking justice and reclaiming my life. Watch as the truth unfolds in this Hollywood-style thriller. Amy had been at Harriman Manufacturing for about 3 months when she became friends with Janet, Mr. Herman's administrative assistant. Initially, Amy would eat in the employees' dining room with her marketing department friends. One day, Janet asked to join her at the table. Amy was surprised by how much they had in common. Soon, they were having lunch together every time Janet was in the office, sometimes in the dining room and sometimes going out. They talked about clothes, friends, husbands, and their past. One day, Janet nudged Amy and whispered about a handsome guy in the dining room, making a cheeky comment. Amy blushed but laughed, agreeing with Janet. After that, they started talking more openly about their college days and relationships. 2 months later, Amy realized she and Janet were good friends. One day, Janet came into the lunchroom excited. She told Amy that Mr. Harrison's administrative assistant had taken a job elsewhere and she was offered the position. Amy congratulated her but was sad about missing their lunches. Janet laughed and told Amy that she could see her more often because Mr. Harriman had given her permission to invite Amy to interview for her assistant position. Amy was thrilled and eager for the interview. That night, Amy could hardly sleep. She dressed in her best work dress the next morning, feeling both excited and nervous. As soon as he arrived, Mr. Harriman called Amy into his office. He looked her over and mentioned that Janet had praised her highly. He said the interview was almost a formality but needed to discuss some job requirements. Mr. Harriman walked around his desk and sat next to Amy, placing his hand on her thigh. He asked if she could handle the late nights and travel required for the job. Amy was uncomfortable but didn't show it, eager for the promotion. She assured Mr. Harriman it wouldn't be a problem. Mr. Harriman continued to ask questions while gently moving his fingers on her thigh. Amy felt a mix of nervousness and a strange sensation in her body. By the end of the interview, Mr. Harriman seemed satisfied and said she would work out fine if Janet approved. Amy, relieved and happy, thanked Mr. Harriman enthusiastically, accidentally hugging him. She quickly apologized, but Mr. Harriman laughed it off and told her to start calling him Howard since they would be working closely together. "Why don't you go with Janet? She'll start explaining your new job and get the paperwork sorted out." Amy was so excited about her new job that she could hardly wait to get home and tell her husband Jeffrey. She loved the new salary, which was almost double her old one, and the job perks. The initial training was simple. Janet first showed her the paperwork, which was nothing new for Amy. She had done most of it before as a marketing assistant. The only new tasks were setting up business meetings and entertainment for customers and vendors. Amy felt a bit young and inexperienced during their first conversations, but she laughed at herself, thinking, "I'm only 26. She was surprised that they arranged nights out for customers and suppliers, including trips to strip clubs. 6 months later, Janet asked Amy to help with a dinner meeting the next evening. This was the first meeting Amy was asked to attend, though she had set up several for Janet. When Amy arrived at the restaurant, she was shown to a private room, which was common for these meetings. She believed it was in case customers brought an escort or wanted to talk business. There was a table with 6 chairs. Janet welcomed Amy with a smile and a gentle kiss on the cheek. "There's a small bar in the corner. Help yourself, then come sit with me. I need to fill you in on the protocol before Howard and our guest arrive." Amy poured herself a glass of wine and sat beside Janet. She was surprised to see Janet in a sheer cocktail dress, low cut in the front and ending mid-thigh. Janet wasn't wearing a bra, which was different from their usual sheer half bras at work. After Amy was seated, Janet asked, "Well, Amy, how do you like the office part of your new job? Do you feel comfortable with it now? Are you ready to learn the more intricate and important social side of the position?" Amy replied, "Oh yes, I really enjoy working with you and Howard. It's great meeting all the important people. I feel like I'm making a significant contribution to the company. I've always dreamed of working in a high-powered environment, but I'm not sure I understand what you mean by the social side of the position." Janet explained, "One part of our job is to coordinate evening events for our top customers and suppliers. Sometimes we travel with Howard for conferences and sales presentations. One of our key roles is to arrange these meetings and serve as hostesses. Often we offer in-house entertainment instead of hiring escorts. We do everything we can to satisfy the attendees no matter what it takes. Do you get my meaning?" Amy hesitated. "I'm not sure. I understand setting up meetings, arranging entertainment, meals, and lodging, but I'm unclear about the social aspects." Janet laughed. "Don't worry about that. You're a young, lively, witty woman. From our talks before your interview, I knew you'd be great at this part of the job. Tonight, just observe and be helpful. If someone wants a drink, get it for them. I'll make sure you leave early enough to get home at a decent hour. We'll discuss tonight in more detail on Monday morning." Amy and Janet chatted a bit more before Howard entered with 3 other men. They had obviously been at a bar before arriving at the restaurant. Janet and Amy stood to greet them. Amy remembered seeing the 3 guests at the office that morning. She was surprised when they hugged Janet and gave her a kiss, and even more surprised when Janet let them fondle her before shooing them into Howard's office with a giggle. Amy recalled hearing a lot of loud laughter and conversation coming from the office most of the morning. Twice, Janet had been called into the office and stayed for over half an hour each time. Both times she came back looking flushed and with her hair and clothes a mess. Amy couldn't believe what she was seeing but was too embarrassed to ask. Seeing Janet dressed like that, Amy wondered if Janet was cheating on her husband. They had only been married a little over 2 years, and Amy couldn't believe Janet would do something like that. Howard put his arm around Amy when she and Janet walked up to him and the 3 strangers. He pulled her close and introduced her, saying, "This is Janet's assistant, Amy. She won't be with us for the entire evening. She's still learning the job, and she needs to get home to her husband tonight." Amy was surprised by the laughter that followed, but she thought it was just their sense of humor. Once the men were seated, Amy and Janet were busy taking notes, providing copies of contracts, and making drinks. The men insisted they sit at the table between tasks. Amy and Janet sat with one of the guests on either side, while Howard sat across the table. After the business was finished, Amy had a couple of drinks with the men. Howard decided it was time to eat, and Amy let the waiter know to serve the meal. During the meal, the man to Amy's left tried to get his hand under her skirt. She pushed him away several times and finally turned to him in frustration. What she saw left her speechless. Janet was kissing the man on her other side, who had his hand down her dress. Amy watched in shock as the man who had been bothering her placed his hand on Janet's bare leg and moved it under her dress. Howard looked at Amy and smiled, saying, "Amy, it looks like Janet is busy right now. Would you please get everyone more drinks? Then, unless you want to stay, you should go home. I think Janet can handle the rest of the evening." Amy remembered that first evening vividly. She left the meeting feeling confused. Jeffrey was still up when she got home and was worried when he saw how she looked. She wouldn't tell him what had happened, but said, "Oh, honey." After the business part of the meal, Howard, Janet, and the customers wanted to socialize. Howard said he and Janet could handle the rest, so I came home. Some of the things Janet did tonight worried and surprised me. It's nothing for you to worry about. I'm sure we'll clear it up Monday. Amy worried about Janet's actions all weekend. She had no answers by Monday morning. Janet's cheerful greeting on Monday left Amy wondering how she could act so normal. Janet noticed Amy's quiet "good morning" and asked, "Amy, what's wrong?" Amy fidgeted and couldn't look at Janet. "Nothing at all, Janet. Well, how could you do something like that to Danny? I mean, you let those men—" Janet laughed and leaned back in her chair. "Oh my God, Amy, you're too much. I didn't do anything to Danny. I just did my job and had fun. Danny has no idea what I do at these meetings, and I hope he never finds out. But I didn't do anything to him. I know you were a little wild before you got married. You told me how much you loved sex with different men and felt a bit sorry to end it when you got serious with Jeffrey. As my assistant, you can enjoy that excitement again and be paid well for it." Amy looked shocked as Janet continued. What you saw was me having a bit of fun while entertaining important clients. If I get some excitement out of it, what's the big deal? It didn't cost Danny or me anything. In fact, we both benefit. I get some excitement, and it leads to great sex with Danny afterward. I get so excited after being with businessmen that I almost wear Danny out. You should try it next time. Besides, studies show that 43% of married men and 27% of married women cheat on their spouses. Why shouldn't I have some fun too, since Danny probably is? Amy shook her head and said, I could never do that to Jeffrey. I just couldn't. Janet laughed and replied, Come on, are you telling me you didn't go home all worked up? I bet you were already excited before you even left the restaurant, and I bet you and Jeffrey had a great weekend, didn't you? Amy blushed and looked away. Janet asked again, Didn't you? Finally, Amy nodded and whispered, Yes, but I could never do what you did. Janet laughed. Nonsense. You told me you had a wild time at your bachelorette party before you got married. If you could have fun then, you can do it now. It's even safer at our meetings because no one will tell Jeffrey. But you don't have to do it. It's just a perk of our job. We get to meet important men who know how to have a good time. Don't worry about it. Just do your job and let me do mine. You'll be fine. If I'm wrong about you, let me know, and you can go back to your old job. Just promise you won't tell Danny. I like to let my hair down at these meetings. Amy almost screamed, Oh no, please! I don't want to go back to my old job. I like this job, and I want to move up in the company. I need the higher salary. I'll do my best to keep the customers happy. Amy felt guilty about what she had promised, but didn't want to betray her friend. She wanted the prestigious position so badly that she was willing to do anything to keep it. She admired powerful men and wanted to be around them. Amy promised to keep quiet and help Janet fully. Janet smirked as she turned to her desk and called Howard. It was touch and go for a moment, but I think she's on board now. I had to remind her about her wild bachelorette party, but she's ready for the next step. After the morning break, Howard came into the outer office and stopped at Janet's desk. You two were great Friday night. Amy, all three guys thought you were really hot and knew your job. They're looking forward to you joining the next negotiations. He turned to Janet and continued, Thanks to you, we got the signatures we needed early this morning. Here's your bonus for last night. Sorry, it's only $10,000 this time, but the contract is only for a year with options to renew. Are you going to do something special with this bonus or save it like the others? Janet smiled. What do you think? It goes into savings as always. After Howard left, Amy stared at Janet holding the cash. She had never seen that much money in cash before. You get $10,000? Janet laughed. Amy, if someone does an exceptional job, they should get a bonus. Howard thinks I was key in getting those signatures. The contract is worth more per unit than the industry norm. Why shouldn't he give me a bonus? And that's not all I got out of it. She giggled and winked at Amy. 3 weeks later, Amy was given the responsibility of setting up the next meeting. On a Tuesday morning, she was told to arrange a meeting for 4 men the following Thursday in a town over 1,200 miles away. She had to organize all the details for the hotel rooms, meeting room, meals, and drinks before leaving for home the Tuesday evening before their Wednesday flight. Janet suggested she bring something more appropriate than business attire to wear to the meeting. She also said, Honey, if you think you'll be late getting back to your room Thursday evening or if you'll be busy, you might tell Jeffrey that cell service is bad at the hotel. Actually, that isn't too far off. You have to go outside for a good signal. The next morning, Amy was getting into her car when she remembered what Janet had said. Jeffrey was about to get into his car too, so she called out to him, Oh, honey, I almost forgot. Janet told me the hotel we're staying at in Sacramento has really poor cell reception. It's a cement building and some meeting rooms don't have any signal. If you can't reach me, just leave a message or call the hotel switchboard. She got back into her car and drove off with a little smile. Jeffrey never asked which hotel she was staying at. Amy was so nervous on the day of the meeting that she could hardly function. After the room was set up, Janet pulled her over to the bar and poured her a strong drink. Drink up, honey. You look as pale as a sheet and you're almost trembling. This is just a business meeting with a little entertainment. Don't worry. We have 4 important men and Howard to entertain. We need you to be at ease. By the time the meal was finished and the drinks were flowing, Amy had relaxed. She and Janet had been busy delivering drinks to the men. At first, Amy tried to avoid their touches, but as the night went on, she started to enjoy the attention. After delivering another round of drinks, Amy sat between the two businessmen she had been talking to. She turned to ask the man on her right if he needed anything and gasped when she saw Janet with her two men. The man next to Amy noticed and said, "Looks like we need to join in, don't we, Amy?" He leaned in for a kiss, and Amy kissed him back. Then she heard Howard say, "What say we move this meeting to more comfortable surroundings?" All four men agreed, and they straightened their clothes for the walk to the elevators. Each woman stopped at the door to her room. Howard opened the doors and gestured them in. Amy and her men entered her room, and Howard followed, opening the door connecting the two rooms. Just before 1 p.m., Janet came into Amy's room looking tired but dressed in her business suit. "Amy, you have to get up and get dressed. Howard has the signed contracts and is on his way back to pick us up. We only have about 3 hours to check out and make our flight home." Amy groaned and forced herself to get up, her body aching. Janet guided her into the shower and packed her bags while she got ready. Amy was in her underwear when Howard knocked on the door. Janet opened the door for him. Amy screamed and tried to cover herself when she saw Howard enter. He laughed and said, "Come on, Amy. I saw everything last night. Why hide now? I was with you 3 times last night. Now cut the false modesty and kiss me." He pulled Amy close and kissed her deeply. Janet looked at Howard over Amy's shoulder and mouthed, "Bingo." Howard nodded and stepped back, saying, "Tasty. Now hurry up and get ready. We don't want to miss our flight." On the flight home, the girls got some sleep so they didn't look too bad when their husbands picked them up at the airport. Howard smiled and shook each man's hand, saying, "You guys should be proud of these two. I wouldn't have gotten the contract signed without them, and we got a better price thanks to their help. Now take them home and show them how much you've missed them." Amy couldn't look Jeffrey in the eyes that evening. She was scared he could tell she had been unfaithful. When Jeffrey asked what she had done during the trip, she said, "Oh, we had dinner with the customers and chatted a bit. Then I went back to my room." As she was saying that, Amy felt sick and ran to the bathroom to throw up. Jeffrey followed her, worried. "Honey, are you okay?" he asked. Amy was crying and throwing up, saying, "Yeah, my stomach has been upset since lunch. We had some greasy Mediterranean food and it's really upset my stomach. I'm really tired. I think I'll go to bed now." On Monday morning, Amy and Janet were talking during their break when Howard walked into the outer office. He smiled and handed out bonuses in cash. Janet received $15,000 and Amy got $10,000. Amy felt a rush of mixed emotions, remembering what she had done to earn her bonus. Over the next few weeks, Amy had to travel once or twice a month. She often worked late and sometimes had meetings on Saturdays. She didn't get a bonus for every meeting, but whenever the meeting resulted in income for the company, she did. Jeffrey was getting upset and complained about her long hours. 3 months after her first solo meeting, Janet came to work one morning looking very upset. She had been crying and continued to cry on and off all morning. Just before lunch, Janet told Amy she might be late because she had a doctor's appointment. Janet didn't return to work that day. The next morning, Janet arrived looking like she hadn't slept at all. As soon as Howard came in, she gave Amy a small smile and walked into his office, staying for over half an hour. When she came out, she had been crying again and looked pale. She told Amy, "Howard wants to see you." Amy walked into Howard's office. He pointed to a chair and said, "Close the door." After she sat down, Howard leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Amy, Janet is leaving for a new job next month. I know you were learning from her and she would have been promoted, but something came up and she'll leave sooner. Do you want her job as my administrative assistant? There will be more late nights and trips. Do you think Jeffrey will be okay with it? You'll be working about a third more hours and traveling more." Amy was shocked by Janet's sudden departure and excited about the new position. The salary was double what she was making, and the bonuses were much larger. In just a year as an assistant, she had saved about $100,000 in bonus money. She had intended to tell Jeffrey about it, but couldn't think of a way to explain the cash, which she hadn't reported for taxes. She thought if Jeffrey ever found out what she was doing, she might need the extra money if he divorced her. The new position would help her add to her secret stash quickly. Janet's bonuses were much higher than hers for each meeting. After discussing the transition with Howard, Amy walked back into the outer office. Janet's eyes were bloodshot, and she held a damp tissue. Amy wrapped her arm around Janet and asked, "What's wrong, Janet? Is there anything I can do to help?" Janet shook her head and whispered, "I'm pregnant. Danny and I have been planning to start a family, but I'm not sure it's his. I think I got pregnant at the first meeting you set up on the coast. I had forgotten I was off the pill until it was too late. The timing is wrong for this to be Danny's child. I don't know what to do. If I get an abortion, I'm afraid Danny will find out. If I don't, I'm afraid it will be obvious the child isn't his. What am I going to do?" That night, Amy went home early. She could hardly wait for Jeffrey to get home so she could tell him about her promotion. Unfortunately, he was far from happy. He asked, "Is there any way you can get out of it? I hate you being gone so much, and I don't want you to be gone more. Why don't you quit or change jobs?" Amy was angry and shouted, "Oh, it's okay for you to have late business meetings and work 50-plus hours a week, but I can't? My job is as important to me as yours is to you. Besides, I'm meeting important, powerful men who can help us get ahead and out of this little town. I'll be making the same amount as you now with the same responsibilities. You have to work late and travel, and so do I. If you can't be happy for me, live with it. If everything goes well, I should be in a job that requires a lot less travel and late nights in a couple of years, and then we can enjoy the things we used to do again." Things were tense for the next several weeks. Jeffrey was still unhappy with Amy's job and her long hours. He was especially upset because their sex life had taken a downturn. Amy now came home very late 1 or 2 nights a week, but Jeffrey managed to adjust. What really bothered him were the weekend meetings. At least once a month, Amy had to stay over the weekend for a meeting away from home or leave early on Sunday to get to one on time. He couldn't understand why and never got a satisfactory answer from her. After Amy had been in her job for 6 months, she came home one day looking upset. Her eyes were red from crying and she was holding a wet handkerchief. Jeffrey walked over and asked, "Amy, honey, what's wrong?" She hugged him tightly and said, "I had a drink after work with Janet and she told me Danny is divorcing her. She got pregnant and had to find a less stressful job when I got the promotion. When she had the baby, it was black. Danny was in the delivery room with her, and when he saw the baby, he looked at Janet and said, 'You're cheating. You and your spawn can go to hell.' He walked out and hasn't seen her since. He didn't take her home, and when she got to the house, the locks had been changed. She was served with divorce papers at work, and he refuses to talk to her." Jeffrey asked, "How did she get pregnant? I mean, was she cheating? The few times I met her and when we went out with her and Danny, she seemed so in love with him. I'm surprised she even found time to cheat if she was as busy as you are." Then it hit him. Those business trips and late nights. She was cheating on Danny, wasn't she? Why did you put up with that? Jeffrey stopped and looked at Amy in shock. Amy felt her stomach clench and her knees began to shake. She started to cry when she heard Jeff say, "Have you been cheating on me at those meetings?" Amy moaned. "No, I've been hit on a lot, but no, I never—" Jeff interrupted. "You better not have been. I've been worried for months that something was wrong. If I ever find out you cheated on me, it's over. You'll be out that door with nothing, just like the prenup says." He turned and walked back into the den while Amy cried. The next morning, a Thursday, Amy was opening the door to the garage and yelled to Jeff, "I'll be late again tonight, honey. We have another late presentation on the Stover proposal." She hurried out, hoping to get into her car before he responded. Amy sighed as the door closed without a comment from Jeffrey. Driving to her office, Amy wished there was a way to reduce her late nights and weekends before Jeffrey got so upset that he did something drastic. Amy loved Jeffrey, or at least she thought she did. Her new job took up a lot of her time and energy, leaving her little time to spend with Jeffrey and even less to be intimate with him. Her job's social responsibilities left her sexually satisfied, and she loved the bonus money. The rich and powerful men she was involved with were just a bonus. She was sure one of them could help her and Jeffrey get better jobs in a real city. Amy knew she only had another year or so in her position before her boss found a new administrative assistant. Janet, the woman she had replaced, made it clear that clients got tired of the same entertainment over time. Amy needed to give it her all while she could. Normally, Howard kept an assistant for about 2 years if she was successful. Afterward, she could get another high-paying position within the company, or he would help her find a comparable or better job elsewhere. If she stayed with the company, she would only be called upon a few times a year to help his current assistant with projects. Occasionally, a salesman or customer might request her time, but as the years passed, those requests became less frequent. Amy thought about her job and the money she and Jeffrey were making. She wished he would take a better job. She just had to convince one of her contacts to offer him a better job and make him take it. If Jeffrey made more money, she probably wouldn't have taken the job as Janet's assistant. At least she wouldn't have kept it after learning about the social part of it. She was scared Jeff would find out what she was doing, but she wanted to make big money and live the good life so badly she was willing to take the chance. Amy giggled to herself and thought, let's be honest. Most of the time, the sex with the various executives and salesmen was amazing. She got a thrill from sleeping around on Jeff, and occasionally she met someone really great. Of course, she hoped to use her friendships with some of the movers and shakers to get better-paying jobs for herself and Jeffrey. She sighed. Jeffrey was a business analyst with an MBA from Wharton, yet he was only making $64,000 a year working for that small company in his hometown. Sometimes she wondered why a feed and farm supply store needed an analyst. She had tried repeatedly to get him to leave and take a better job, but he always refused. When Amy got home, she found a note from Jeff. He told her he had to go to Steelville to consult with the management of the feed and farm supply store. He knew she wouldn't take off work in the middle of the week, so he just packed and left. His note continued, "Since I'll be home for the meeting, I think I will spend a few days visiting the folks. I'll probably be home early next week. If you need me, call my cell or Dad and Mom. I'll probably stay with them or in one of the cabins at the resort." Amy clenched her jaw in anger. She didn't know what he saw in that small town. The population of Steelville was just over 1,000. The next larger town was 25 miles away and only had about 10,500 people. That's why she insisted they work in Springville. At least Springville was big enough to have some nightlife. Not that they went out much. Even before she took her new job, Jeff refused to go out often. She had to force him to join the country club, and then he almost never went. Imagine a grown businessman who only played golf when he had to. Why he preferred fishing and hunting was beyond her. Jeff hadn't told anyone he was coming home, so when he pulled into his parents' driveway, he wasn't surprised to see they were gone. He figured they were either in town having supper or over at a family member's house. Since it was only a short way down the road, he went to his grandfather Fielding's home first and hit pay dirt. The whole family was out on the patio having a party. His sister saw him first and screamed, "Jeff! My God, what dragged you away from the big city?" She ran up to him and gave him a big hug. The rest of the family wasn't far behind. Everyone was glad to see him. After the greetings, Jeff asked what the party was for. They told him, and he was embarrassed. He had forgotten it was his sister's baby's second birthday. Jeff sank into a chair with a sigh and gratefully drank down the shot of Glenlivet his grandfather handed him. He held his glass out for a refill as he started to relax, even with the children's screams and laughter. He could hear the nearby stream flowing over the rocks on its way to the swimming hole. From time to time, Jeffrey caught his grandmother watching him. Once, he saw her whispering to his mother, father, and grandfather Jim. The party slowly wound down, and everyone left except for Jeffrey, his grandparents, and his parents. They all pulled up chairs and faced him. His grandmother spoke for the group. "Okay, son, out with it. You come here in the middle of the week without your wife and look like someone stole your favorite toy. Now cut the crap and tell us what's wrong in Springville." Jeff stared at the old woman in shock. Was he that obvious? He opened his mouth and closed it, taking a deep breath. Finally, he said, "I don't know if anything's wrong, but sometimes I feel like Amy's up to something." "Amy's what?" his grandmother asked. "Cheating on you or leaving you? Come on now, I recognize that look. God help me, I've seen it before." All the adults looked at each other, and his grandmother blushed a little. He remembered that his grandmother and grandfather had been divorced for a little over 4 years before remarrying after their second spouses died in a traffic accident. Could the divorce have been because Grandma had cheated on Grandpa Jim? Jeff sighed and shook his head. "I just don't know," he said. "I can't find any evidence, but I have strong suspicions." Amy was the secretary to the administrative assistant at Harriman for several months. She had to dress nicely, but her outfits and makeup looked more like she was on the prowl than working in a business. She had to work late several nights a month and took overnight trips several times. After those nights, she wouldn't have anything to do with me sexually. She did everything she could to avoid me, even starting arguments. When the administrative assistant took another job, Amy became the administrative assistant. She's away from home at least one night a week until after midnight, and once or twice a month, she takes a 2 to 4 day business trip with Mr. Harriman. Almost all the trips include a full day of the weekend. Amy refuses to talk about her job and refuses to quit. She keeps saying she only has to hang in there for a year or two, then she can apply for a less demanding job and will almost be assured of getting it. I've done some research, and almost all of Mr. Harriman's administrative assistants have held the job for 2 years. All his assistants are young, in their early to late 20s, and married. He seems to prefer married assistants. I couldn't find one who had been single, even though they might be better suited for the job because they're freer to travel. Some administrative assistant secretaries don't work out and leave after their 6-month probation period. Everyone who lasts past 6 months has gone on to be Mr. Harriman's administrative assistant. All the admin assistants get a job that pays the same or more if they stay with the company, or a similar job if they leave. I found 3 of the assistants whose marriages ended in divorce because they were caught cheating during business meetings or trips. Amy was only an administrative assistant secretary for about a year because her boss got pregnant and left the position about 6 months after Amy did. Her boss had a child, and her husband filed for divorce. The child was black, and Janet and her husband were both white. With all the business meetings and trips, Janet must have gotten pregnant on company business. Considering Amy's schedule, she only has about 3 nights a week at home with her husband, and if she's like Amy, she's exhausted those nights. When Amy told me about her ex-boss, I let my mouth run without thinking. I said, "What happened? How did it happen? Was she a cheater or what?" I was upset and angry with Amy and her schedule. I blurted out, "Those business trips and late nights, she was cheating on Danny then, wasn't she? You were with her a lot of the time. Why did you put up with that?" I remember looking at Amy in shock as the idea hit me. She blanched, then turned red and stared at me. She looked scared and started to cry when I asked, "Have you been cheating on me at those meetings?" Amy said she hadn't, but admitted she had been hit on a lot. I told her, "You better not have been cheating. I've been worried for months that something was wrong. Now I think I know. If I ever find out you screwed around on me, it's over. You'll be out that door with nothing, just like the prenuptial agreement says." Then I walked into the den while she cried. This morning, before she left, Amy yelled down the hallway that she had another late-night meeting. I know it's supposedly her job, but I don't see why Howard needs 2 women with him at every meeting unless something fishy is going on. I came home partly to see if Grandpa would authorize the investigation company to check up on Howard and Amy. Of course, I wanted to see all of you too. I'll pay for the investigation myself, but I need permission to make the change and work for Homer. All the older Fieldings leaned back in their chairs after Jeff finished talking. Finally, his father Paul said, "Son, there seems to be something off about this picture, but I can't pinpoint what it is right now. From what you've told us about Amy in the past, this could be something she would do. You know how she feels about big cities and nightlife. We were worried when she refused to move to a smaller town than Springville, but it was your decision, so we didn't say anything." Paul turned to his father and said, "Dad, I think we should support Jeff on this. Let's get Homer and Jeff together tomorrow and see what they can come up with." Paul then said, "It's getting late. Jen, are you ready to go home?" He looked at Jeff and asked, "Jeff, are you coming out to the house or staying here?" Jeff sat for a moment and then said, "If there's a cabin open, I think I'll go to the lodge. I might get some fishing in while I think about this mess. Call me on my cell when you have the time set up with Homer, please." Jim went into the house and got the key for the resort office. He handed it to Jeff and said, "This is the key to the resort front door. The other key is for my office. The cabin keys are in the center desk drawer. Use the honeymoon cabin, son. I know it's no honeymoon for you, but it's the best and most secluded cabin. Plus, it's closer to the best swimming and fishing spots. We don't have it booked for the next few days, so you can use it as long as you want. Do you want to have breakfast with us here or in town, or do you want to eat at the resort?" Jeff thought for a moment and then replied, I really don't know right now. I don't feel much like breakfast. I'll find something at the resort if that's okay. By the time Jeff drove the 3 miles to the resort, got the key, and unloaded his bags, it was almost 3 a.m. He just stripped and crawled into bed without unpacking or showering. The next thing he knew, he heard a female voice yelling, "Mr. Fielding, are you still in here? This is Abigail. Your father tried to call you, and when you didn't answer your cell, he called the office. He says your meeting is set for lunch. You need to be in the cafe at 12:30 if that's okay." Jeff heard footsteps coming toward his bedroom and hurriedly reached for the bed sheet to cover himself. He stared at the very lovely woman who walked through the door. She blushed, and he realized she had seen him before he got completely covered. "I'm sorry, Abigail. I wasn't expecting visitors and, well, you caught me off guard." Abigail giggled and said, "That's okay, sir. I'm sorry I barged in on you like that, but I knocked and you didn't answer. When I came in, I didn't hear anything, so I was checking if you were here or out fishing. Your father said you might be on the river." She looked at him shyly and said softly, "Besides, before my family left me, I had 2 brothers. I didn't see anything I haven't seen a lot of times before." Abigail smiled and said, "It's 10:30 now. Do you want me to find some breakfast for you, or do you want to wait for lunch?" Jeff smiled and said, "No breakfast. But if you have some coffee, I would be forever grateful if you would share it with me." Abigail looked at him and smiled. "We sure do, and I just made it fresh. Want me to bring some down, or will you have it with me in the dining room?" "I'll come up. See you in a few. And Abigail, thanks." Jeff arrived at the cafe about 10 minutes early and found his father, grandfather, and a man introduced as Homer Scroggins already there. They shook hands and made small talk while they ordered. Then Jeff's father, Paul, said, "Son, I filled Homer in on what you told us last night. Why don't you give it to him again and then tell us all you know about Harriman's business? If you want, we can go back to the resort before you get into the personal items with Homer." For the next 30 minutes, Jeff told Homer about how Amy was acting and how much time she spent working late and on business trips. He shared the small amount of information he had uncovered about the past administrative assistants and their secretaries. Jeff was surprised he didn't know more about Harriman's business and vowed to remedy that when he returned home. All he knew for certain was that they printed all types of business forms. He was in the business of looking up companies and analyzing their reports. It would be more difficult since Harriman wasn't publicly traded, but he could get a lot of information on them. He promised to gather that information and get it to Homer within a week. When they got back to the resort, Jeffrey invited Homer into his cabin and offered him a drink before they started. Homer said, "No thanks, not right now. But if you want one, feel free. As you know, I recorded our talk in the cafe, and I would like to record this one. Do you mind?" Jeffrey sighed and said, "No, go ahead." Homer then said, "Okay, Mr. Fielding, please tell me everything you can about your wife, Amy, her job, and her responsibilities. I also need to know about her friends and clubs, as well as anything unusual you might have noticed over the last few months. Please don't leave out anything that might be related." Jeff sighed and began. "Well, Homer, I met Amy in the fall semester of my last year in college. She was going to finish her bachelor's degree in May, and I was going to finish my master's degree the same month. I was the teaching assistant for a business class she was taking. She was beautiful, witty, and always had a large group of friends, both male and female. I was mesmerized by her, but at first I tried to keep my distance as I felt an instructor should. To this day, I'm not sure if she really had trouble with the coursework or if she was pretending, but she kept coming to me for help, and I would give it to her. At first, we met in the library, but after a few sessions, we would go to a local hangout to continue our conversations or just relax with a beer. Before long, we started dating. I loved so much about her. I fell deeper and deeper under her spell. Amy was caring, kind, and considerate. We seemed to like the same things. We both enjoyed the same type of food and movies. We had similar outlooks politically and socially. We danced and partied with the best of them. As we became more attached, she cut back on going out with her friends until we spent almost every night together. By Valentine's Day, I was madly in love with her. After a romantic meal, I asked her to marry me. She agreed, and we set the date for June 13th after we graduated. Everything went great. Her family liked me, and I liked them. The only problem seemed to be with my family. For some reason, none of them were as enthralled with Amy as I was. They all told me she was witty, charming, and brilliant, but my grandmother especially warned me to watch her, saying she didn't think Amy was right for me. When I told them I was going to marry her, they all supported us. I don't know if I didn't tell Amy about my plans after graduation or if she ignored me, but when I let her know I was going to work for the family firm and move back here to work, she got upset. She said there was no way she was going to live in this small town and that I needed to rethink my career plans. She had worked hard to get out of the little town she was raised in and didn't want to end up in another one. This was our first serious fight and almost caused us to break up. Finally, I agreed to compromise. I would work for the firm, but we would live in Springville. She wasn't happy with that because she thought Springville was too small, but she accepted it. After we moved to Springville and she found her first job, the old Amy seemed to return. She was happy and carefree again, and we had so much fun. She would go out with friends occasionally, but usually we went to dances and social events almost every weekend. She insisted we join the country club so we could meet the right people and network better. After a year, she began hinting that we needed more money and a better job. She said we had met enough people that I could find a higher-paying job with some of the larger companies in Springville or another city. I was living on my salary from our company plus what Amy made. We were saving money, but she wanted more. Amy always wanted to be with the big fish, go to expensive resorts, and travel the world. Large cities and nightlife excited her. She loved meeting people she thought were rich and powerful. I guess I messed up by not making sure she knew I preferred spending my spare time fishing and visiting friends and family. I sometimes feel her need for excitement is causing her to stray. When she became Janet's secretary after about 6 weeks, she started wearing more expensive and revealing clothes. By the time she had been in the new position for 6 months, her entire wardrobe had changed. It was still okay for business, but pushed the limits of what was appropriate. Her skirts were shorter, and her blouses were thinner and sexier. She didn't own any business slacks. I questioned her about this and told her it made her look like she was trying to attract men at work. That made her very angry, and she avoided me for several days before we resumed being intimate. Before Amy was promoted to administrative assistant, we had sex 4 to 6 times a week. After she became Janet's assistant, it dropped to 2 or 3 times a week. Now that she is Howard's assistant, I'm lucky if we have sex once a week. She seems to avoid me as much as possible when she comes home late from work. I'm not even allowed to see her nude or touch her on those nights. She says she is too tired and needs to relax. It's even worse after her long trips. Homer sat quietly, reviewing his notes and occasionally asking questions to fill in the blanks. Finally, he said, "Okay, Jeff, with the addresses and signed releases you gave me at the cafe, I think I can get started. If I need anything else, I'll call you." Jeff tried to relax, but all he could think about was Amy and their problems. By Sunday afternoon, he decided to return home. Before leaving Steel Village, Jeff called Amy to let her know he was on his way back. His family didn't want him to go so soon, but understood. The closer Jeff got to home, the more nervous he became. When he pulled into his driveway, there was a strange car in front of the garage door on Amy's side. Jeff parked and walked into the house carrying his luggage. He saw Amy's boss, Howard, sitting in the living room. Amy was nowhere to be seen. When Howard saw Jeff, he stood up and said, "Jeffy, we need to talk. Leave your luggage there and come in here for a few minutes. We need to straighten some things out. Then I'll let Amy fill you in." Jeff was immediately furious. Not only had Howard called him Jeffy, but he was also giving him orders in his own house. He walked into the living room and confronted Howard. "I don't like being called Jeffy, Howie, and I especially don't like being ordered around in my own house. I suggest you leave before I throw you out." Howard laughed and sat back down. "You can try to throw me out, but I don't think you're man enough to do it. If you don't change your attitude, you'll be in a world of hurt. Now sit down and shut up while I explain how things are going to be from now on. Your attitude has upset Amy, and because of that, she messed up a very important contract for me on Friday evening. I lost a deal worth several $100,000 because she couldn't focus on the negotiations. I had 3 very unhappy visitors this weekend, and you're to blame. I want you to ease up on Amy and let her do the job I hired her to do. She is one of the best assistants I've ever had, and her negotiating skills are top-notch. Your accusations and demands are messing up her ability to concentrate, and I will not allow that to continue. You have a small-time job for a minor company and think you're in control. Well, let me tell you, I can buy and sell you several times over. Don't think I will allow you to mess up my business. When Amy comes in here, you listen to her and give her your support, or it will be the biggest mistake of your life." After he said that, Howard stood, sneered at Jeffrey, and walked out the front door. Jeffrey was sitting in shock when he heard the bedroom door open. He watched Amy quietly walk into the room and take a chair facing him. "Honey, I'm sorry Howard was so rough on you. I tried to talk him out of it, but he was very angry when he found out why I was upset on Friday. The final straw was when I couldn't help with the negotiations. I begged him to let me talk to you, but he wouldn't let me. Honey, you know he's right, though. You have an MBA from Wharton. You don't need to work for a feed store. Just support me for the next year or two until I can get a better job. Then we can leave this town for a larger city where we can make real money. I'm making contacts that can help you get a powerful position in a good company. Howard says if you don't leave things alone, he will ruin you, and honey, he can do it. About 4 years ago, a couple of his assistants' husbands started doing what you're doing. He had a similar conversation with them, but they wouldn't let it go. They divorced their wives and caused so much trouble that he had to replace both his admin assistant and her secretary. He ruined the 2 ex-husbands. He has friends on the police force and in business all over this area. The 2 men lost their jobs, their wives, and had to leave the area. They couldn't get good references and had to take low-paying jobs. Oh, Jeff, I don't want that to happen to us. I hate the thought of Mr. Harriman doing that to us. Please, just help me do my job. I promise to pay more attention to you." Jeff sat back and stared at Amy. "I can't believe you just said that, Amy. All I asked of you, all I expect from you, is what we vowed before God and our family when we got married. For better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part. And here, too, I pledge my faithfulness. I understand some travel and late work is possible, but I think you are taking it too far. I will not accept things as they are now. If you haven't cheated on me and want this marriage to last, we need to make changes. The discussion your boss had with me should have been between us. You already brought him into our relationship. That was a mistake. And as for your boss, if he ever tries that tone with me again, he'll need help walking." After saying that, Jeff stood and took his bags into the bedroom to unpack. He heard Amy crying while he worked. The next 3 weeks went on as before. Amy worked late, and when she came home, she wouldn't let Jeff near her. He got a quick peck on the lips or cheek, and she would head off for a soak in the tub. She took a long business trip with Howard and her secretary. Jeff was so angry with Amy that the 2 times she tried to have sex with him, he refused. Friday of the 3rd week, Homer called Jeff at work. "Jeffrey, I'm afraid you were right. This may be the worst case of cheating and betrayal by a wife I've seen in years. Can you come back home this weekend so I can give you the report and explain what we found?" Jeffrey sighed and said, "Damn, I was afraid of that." "Sure, Homer. Amy's off on another long business trip. She doesn't plan to be home until Sunday. Shall we meet tomorrow morning at the resort? Say, about 10 a.m.? Jeffrey didn't bother to call Amy or leave her a note. He knew it was useless to call her on her cell. She never answered calls during business meetings or trips. He packed enough clothes to stay away for several days. After all, he worked for the family business, so he didn't need his business attire unless he had an important meeting. He packed 1 suit, a couple of office casual outfits, and lots of everyday clothes. Jeff called his parents and grandparents to let them know he was coming, so they had his cabin ready when he arrived. Grandpa Jim and his father Paul met him at the resort. His father hugged him and said, "I'm sorry, son. Homer wouldn't tell me what he found, but he said it was really bad." Jim looked at Jeffrey and gave him a big hug. "I know what you're going through. I was there several years ago. I'll be around after Homer leaves, or if you want, I can sit in with you." Jeff thought for a moment and said, "What the hell? I'm sure this is the end of my marriage, and if Homer has what I think he has, I really don't care if Amy is embarrassed. If she cheated, the marriage is over. So what do I care if you see some evidence? Come if you want to." After that, they settled Jeff into his cabin and all went back to the main house for supper. Afterwards, they sat on Jim's patio with their drinks and watched the sun go down. Jeff sighed and said, "You know, I really miss this. It almost killed me when Amy wouldn't move back here after we graduated. If I hadn't loved her so much, I think I would have come home without her, and we wouldn't have even gotten married. If this goes the way I think it will, I want to move our research offices back here if you don't mind." Jim looked at Paul and said, "Well, son, I don't have a problem with that, and I don't suppose anyone else will either. I'll check to be sure, but you just plan on making the move. It'll be nice to have most of the family here in town again." Finally, around 11 p.m., Grandma helped a very inebriated Jeffrey back to his cabin and tucked him into bed. Well, figuratively speaking, she helped him into the building, sat him on his bed, and helped him take his shoes and trousers off. He fell back, and she pulled a blanket over him. The next morning, just after 8, Abigail woke Jeff up again. This time, Abigail knocked on the front door, and when Jeff answered, she came into the living area carrying a pot of fresh coffee. "Mr. Fielding, your grandmother told me to have this coffee ready when I woke you up. I'll put it on the stove to keep it warm. Do you want me to make you some breakfast before your meeting with Mr. Scroggins?" Jeff poked his head out of the bedroom door and said, "Thanks, Abigail. If it's not too much trouble, I would like some breakfast. What are my choices?" Abigail smiled and said, "I can make a country breakfast with ham, sausage, or bacon, or a Western omelet with what I have here. Or I can go back and get the pancake makings. Just let me know." Jeff smiled and said, "The Western omelet and hash browns sound great. While you're doing that, I'll grab a quick shower." Abigail finished the meal and went to the bathroom door to let Jeff know it was ready. She knocked but didn't get an answer, so she opened it a crack to call out. She blushed at what she saw. Jeff was sitting nude on the toilet, looking at a picture of Amy and crying. The mirror was steamy from his shower, and he was only partly dry. Abigail pulled her head back and spoke louder into the crack. "Mr. Fielding, your breakfast is ready." Jeff jumped and answered in a cracked voice, "Thanks, Abigail. I'll be right there." Jeff was finishing his breakfast and talking to Abigail when his father and grandfather arrived. Abigail quickly loaded the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and said, "Oh, I'll get back to the office now. Sorry I kept you so long," and ran out of the building. The three men sat drinking coffee and chatting until Homer arrived around 9:45 a.m. All three stood up as Jeff let Homer into the cabin. After they all shook hands, Jeff asked, "Homer, where do you want to sit? We can use the coffee table for documents, and if you have DVDs, we can watch them on the TV, or we can go into the dining area." Homer thought for a moment and then said, "We'd be more comfortable in here. If you want to watch the DVD while I'm here, we can, but I've seen it, and would advise you to watch it alone, or better yet, take it to an attorney without seeing it. It's pretty graphic, Jeff. My written report should be enough. Some of our operatives are still watching Mrs. Fielding at her business meeting, but this one is just like the others since we began watching her. We have recordings of the daytime activities, and they really do negotiate contracts and transact business during the day. But after quitting time, your wife, her boss, and those involved in the negotiations begin to engage in sex. Most of the times we followed her, Mrs. Fielding spends the entire night having sex with their customers. Mr. Harriman joins in, of course. Then the next morning, she sleeps late before rejoining the negotiations for lunch and the afternoon session. Her assistant also participates in the orgies, but is not as deeply involved in the evening sessions in Springville. We haven't been able to get into the meetings she has at her office to see what goes on there. The few dinner meetings she has had in Springville hotels have not resulted in anything sexual. She did have one private meeting in a closed room that we couldn't access. The operative following her heard questionable sounds coming from the room. He followed her up to a room with two gentlemen. She stayed for about an hour, then left. She didn't look much different when she left, but as you know, that proves nothing. After getting the general information and documents from Homer, Jeff thanked him and escorted him to the door. When he returned to the living area, he saw his father and grandfather reading over the report. From time to time, one of them would curse. Finally, Jim threw the remainder of the report onto the table with an oath. He picked up the DVD packet, looked at it, then at Jeff and Paul. He handed it to Jeff and said, "Sonny, I looked at the pictures of your grandmother and read all the reports. It's bad enough just reading it. What do you want to do with these things?" Jeff stood holding the DVD packet. Then with a curse, he walked to the player. While inserting the first DVD, he said, "I don't think I can hurt much more, and I just have to see it with my own eyes. I understand if you don't want to see any of this, but I have to see at least the first bit." Jeff watched as his father and grandfather left the cabin, then hit the play button. The DVD started with Amy, Mr. Harriman, and 4 other men walking into a hotel room. Amy was giggling and playfully swatting at the men's hands as they fondled her. Her blouse was already unbuttoned, and he could tell she had no bra on. The camera zoomed in, showing a hickey on her left breast. The date stamp on the DVD showed this was taken the week after he had authorized the surveillance. When the door closed, Amy turned and wrapped her arms around a distinguished older man. They moved into a deep, sensual kiss. Meanwhile, 2 other men were slipping her skirt and blouse off. Jeff could hear her moan as one of the men began touching her. Amy stood in the center of a circle of men, kissing and letting them touch her. Howard walked through the connecting door and partially closed it. The men pushed Amy back onto the bed. The older man was clearly in charge. The others waited their turn. One by one, they took turns. Jeff trembled as he watched. After about 5 minutes, Amy screamed in climax. The silver-haired man pulled back and said, "Damn, Amy, doesn't your husband take care of you at all? I think you're hotter than last month in Springville." Jeff sat in silence for a while, then stood, replaced the DVD in its envelope, and poured himself a glass of Glenlivet. He walked to the porch and was startled to see his grandfather waiting for him. He felt embarrassed as tears ran down his cheeks. Jim stood and put his arm around his grieving grandson. "Son, I know how you feel. I watched your grandma cheat on me and tried to forget it with Glenlivet. It just doesn't work. Have your drink while we talk and let it go. Do what you have to do and move on." Jeff looked at his grandfather and said, "I need the name of a good divorce attorney. I may need a criminal attorney too. I'm going to make them pay for this. He came into my house and threatened me. He took my wife from me. By God, he's going to pay." Jim thought for a moment and asked, "Did you know any of the men?" Jeff shook his head and said, "Only Amy's boss. I have the first names of the 4 from the week after I was here. I haven't looked at any other DVDs, but I don't expect to know them. She apparently only sleeps with customers. I doubt any of our friends were involved." Jim said, "You let me worry about getting even with Howard. I think I can hurt him more than you can without laying a hand on him. Focus on the divorce and what needs to be done. I'll check on Harriman and his friends." Jim pulled out his cell and dialed a number. "Homer, it's Jim Fielding again. I've got another job for you. Take the information you got for Jeff and find out the names of the men in the pictures. Get everything you can about them. Their wives' names, addresses, jobs, clubs, everything. We're going to teach them not to mess with married women." I could hear the DVD while Jeff played it. They were laughing and talking about Amy's husband not taking care of her. They knew she was married. "We're going to hit them in the pocketbook." Jim thought some more and made another call. "Steve, it's Jim Fielding. I know it's the weekend, but how would you like to come out to the resort and talk to my grandson? He needs a good divorce attorney. I know you do a good job. Bring your wife, too, and I'll feed you both and make sure you get the good booze and wine. We're in the honeymoon cabin. See you in about an hour." After the calls, Jim looked at Jeff and said, "Let's sit on the back deck and watch the river while we wait for Steve. He's semi-retired, but he did a damn good job for me. When we're done, those men will wish they had never messed with this family." Jim and Jeff were sitting on the back deck when they heard a car pull up in front of the cabin. A distinguished older man walked around the side of the cabin and saw them. He looked at the bottle on the table and said, "Hell, you didn't even wait for me before getting into the good stuff. Pour me a stiff one and then let's get started. I've got my recorder ready to go. When you start, I'll turn on the recorder to get the whole conversation on tape." As they poured Steve a drink and settled in, they heard a car drive off. Jim started to go check, but Steve stopped him. "Relax," Steve said. "That'll be Jolene going over to your place. I told her if I didn't come out, she should head over there. Now give me that drink and let's get started. I want to get the business out of the way so we can get to some serious drinking." Jim laid out the basic problem, and then Jeff filled Steve in on the details. After hearing everything, Steve leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. Then he asked, "Well, what exactly do you want out of this, Jeff? We can go for the jugular or take a quieter route. I know you're hurting, but think carefully. Sometimes revenge backfires." Jim opened his mouth to respond, but Jeff spoke first. "I have an airtight prenuptial agreement with Amy. I want to follow it to the letter. It says if either of us is caught cheating, they leave the marriage with only what they brought into it. Anything accumulated after the marriage becomes the sole property of the innocent party. If both cheat, we split the marital assets. I haven't cheated, so I want it all. I think your partner wrote the agreement because you were out of the country." Jeffrey smiled and took a sip of his drink. "That prenuptial agreement might be the best thing Amy ever did for me. I was so in love with her, I would have married her without one. But she insisted because she had family members who cheated and got divorces. She felt the injured party deserved a pound of flesh. She even said that if she caught me cheating, she deserved it all. Now, after the way she's disrespected our family business, I think she deserves what's coming." Steve, excited, said, "We have a copy of the prenuptial agreement. We wrote it for you. If Solange wrote it, it has teeth. I'll check the files. When do you want this to happen? Do you want to talk to her first?" Jeff thought for a moment and replied, "The sooner the better. I don't intend to return to the house except to gather my personal belongings and some furniture. Grandpa said I can use this cabin as long as I want. If you need to reach me, call my cell first, then here. I'll set up an answering machine." Steve thought for a moment and said, "If I find the prenuptial agreement in the office, I could have the paperwork finished Monday. I'll file it with the court Monday evening or Tuesday morning. Then it's just a matter of getting someone to serve Amy in Springville, probably by Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday." Jeff smiled and said, "Fine, I'll wait until she's at work Tuesday to start moving things out of the house. I don't want to tip my hand too soon. I'd like the papers served before Wednesday noon, because she often flies out for meetings then. I want her to know I'm divorcing her while she's trying to work. I'd rather not face her boss again, though. He threatened violence the last time I walked into my house and found him there. I don't want to risk beating him up and ending up in jail for it." Steve looked shocked and said loudly, "What? You didn't tell me he threatened you when you mentioned he talked to you about Amy. What exactly did he say?" Jeff replied, "I don't remember exactly. Basically, he told me he would ruin me and run me out of town if I didn't leave Amy alone. He said he had powerful people who would help him with that task. He also hinted he wasn't against using violence on me if he felt like it. I've slept since then and don't remember the conversation word for word." Steve looked at Jeff and said, "Before you go home, I want you to get a small recorder. You should have it with you at all times. If you talk to Amy, her boss, or anyone else involved in this mess, record it. We might get something useful. I'll tell Homer to keep up the surveillance on Amy, your home, and her business dealings." Jeff stayed in Steelville until early Tuesday morning. Then he took the resort's box truck back to his home. One of his cousins went with him to help load the vehicle. Things didn't work out exactly as Jeff had hoped. Steve must have been very efficient because Amy came tearing into the house shortly after 4:30 Tuesday afternoon. Jeff hadn't finished taking the things he wanted, and she caught him. His cousin was in the backyard shed packing Jeff's tools, so Amy didn't see him when she saw Jeff carrying a box to the truck. She jumped in front of him, crying, "Jeff, how could you do this to me? Just because I told you my job was as important as yours and refused to quit? Now you think you can divorce me? And what's this about you getting all the marital assets? I worked hard for those things, just like you did. And you better believe I intend to get my share if you insist on this divorce." Jeff looked at her in disgust and said, "Amy, I'm just following the letter of the prenuptial agreement you insisted on and we both signed. Get your copy and read it if you don't believe me. In fact, I'm being generous. I'm not taking all the furniture. You can have what I leave if you want it. Otherwise, I'll sell it with the house." Amy was furious. "We'll see about that. You just screwed up big time, Jeff." She stepped aside and made a phone call. Jeff heard her say, "Howard, I just got home and found Jeff loading a truck. He insists on following the prenuptial agreement. I guess we have to hit him with the sledgehammer after all." "Okay, I'll wait." Amy walked to the front porch and sat in a chair, watching Jeff as he loaded the truck. He was about to walk behind the house for another load when Howard's car screeched into the driveway. Howard jumped out before the car had fully stopped and ran toward Jeff, yelling, "You damn little pissant! I told you not to screw with me. You've done it now. You have Amy so upset it's affecting my business. You better have deep pockets, boy, because I'm going to hire a good lawyer and break that prenuptial agreement. We'll take everything you have. When I'm done with you, you'll be lucky to have the clothes on your back. No one screws with my business or me. You're going to pay. I told you if you couldn't handle Amy's success, you should just quietly divorce her and leave. But you had to go macho on us, didn't you? You've screwed up royally now. I'm going to beat you up like I promised. Then you're going to unload that truck and get out of here." When Howard swung at Jeff, Jeff ducked, grabbed his arm, and threw him over his shoulder. Jeff held onto the arm and heard the cartilage pop when it came out of the socket. Howard would be lucky if that was all that happened. Jeff landed 3 punches on Howard's face and kicked him twice, once in the ribs and once in the crotch. Jeff looked up to see his cousin Joe filming the altercation. They had brought the camera and recorder just in case, and now they were both glad they had. Jeff left Howard lying there and returned to the backyard for another load. When he came back, Amy was helping Howard up. She looked at Jeff, her face white, and hissed, "You asshole, how could you?" She helped Howard to his car and they drove off, probably to a hospital. Jeff and Joe finished loading the truck and left. Before they reached the end of the street, a patrol car stopped them. 2 officers approached the vehicle with their hands on their weapons, ordering Jeff and Joe to get out. They were searched, cuffed, and read their Miranda rights. The lead officer said, "You are under arrest for assault, battery, and burglary." At the police station, the camera and all their possessions were taken. Jeff had left the recorder inside the truck in his jacket pocket. Since it was after closing time, Jeff used his one phone call to contact his father. When Jeff explained what had happened, his father was furious. The next morning, Jeff and Joe were allowed to see their attorney, Steve, as soon as he arrived from Steelville. Steve grinned and said, "Can't you two stay out of trouble? Now tell me exactly what happened and we'll get you out of here as soon as we can. Your preliminary hearing is scheduled for 11 this morning." At the hearing, Steve explained to the judge that there was a divorce in progress, and Jeff was merely removing some of his personal items from the premises. He stated that since Jeff owned the residence, there could be no burglary. The judge considered this, but the prosecutor said, "Your Honor, there is a restraining order in effect, keeping Mr. Fielding 500 feet from Amy Fielding, her residence, and her workplace. Mr. Fielding violated that order. His altercation with Mr. Harriman was over that, as well as the fact he was not supposed to be removing items from the home until after the divorce." Steve turned to Jeff and asked, "Why didn't you tell me about the restraining order?" Jeff replied, "I've never seen a restraining order or been served with one. This is the first time I'm hearing about it." Steve addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client states he has never been served with a restraining order and has no knowledge of it. It also seems strange that Mrs. Fielding was served her divorce papers at 3:37 p.m., returned home at 4:30 p.m., yet had time to see an attorney, get a restraining order filed, and served before her husband began removing his personal property that morning. May I see this restraining order and proof that it was served?" The prosecutor looked nervous and began shuffling his papers. The judge asked for a copy of the order. The prosecutor said, "Your Honor, I don't have a copy with me. Mr. Harriman assured me one was in force and he would see I got a copy. Let me check with my office." He made a phone call and then turned to the judge. "My assistant is bringing the order now. Can we continue while we wait for it to arrive?" The judge nodded. "Please do." The prosecutor continued, "Now, on the assault charge, Mr. Fielding saw Mr. Harriman approaching him in his yard, trying to stop him from loading more of Mrs. Fielding's belongings. He dropped the box he was carrying and assaulted Mr. Harriman, causing grievous bodily harm. I have a sworn complaint from Mr. Harriman and statements from the hospital emergency room and the officer who interviewed him and Mrs. Fielding." Jeff leaned to Steve and said, "That's a bunch of bull. I have the recording you said to make, and Joe filmed the whole thing. The recorder is in my coat pocket in the truck, and the police have the camera with our belongings." Steve said, "Good, that should help. And if the investigator following Amy got some good pictures, we can clear this up." He stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client states he did not attack Mr. Harriman. He was merely defending himself. He has a recording and a DVD to document this. Additionally, a private detective was following Mrs. Fielding and should have pictures in his report to support my client's claims." The judge sighed and said, "Where are these pieces of evidence?" "Your Honor, the police have the camera with Mr. Fielding's belongings. The tape is in their vehicle in a coat pocket. We have not yet received the investigator's report. If we can adjourn until we can obtain these items, I believe we can clear up this mess." The judge looked at his watch and said, "It's almost noon. Court adjourned until 1:30 for lunch and to gather additional evidence. I presume this will be enough time to obtain the items you should have had in your possession when this hearing commenced." Jeff and Joe were led away to their holding cell. Steve called the investigators to expedite receiving the surveillance report for the previous day, then went straight to the police office to retrieve the camera. When he got there, he was given the camera, but there was no DVD inside. Arguing with the property officer was futile. The officer insisted that what Steve had was all they had taken into evidence. Strangely, the inventory listed the camera but made no mention of a recording disc. Steve then went to the impound yard. He arrived just as an officer was opening the truck door. Steve walked up to the officer and asked, "What are you doing opening this truck?" The officer looked nervous and said, "This truck might contain evidence in a burglary, and I am searching it for that evidence. Besides, what right do you have to ask me about my duties? I better see some identification. You're not even supposed to be here unescorted." At that moment, a grizzled old officer walked up and said, "Mr. Johnson, I'm having trouble finding the key for the truck. It isn't on the key rack where it's supposed to be." The officer confronting Steve looked upset and paled visibly when Steve said, "Do you suppose the key isn't where it belongs because this officer has it in his hand without authorization?" The officer started to back away but was blocked by the older officer and Steve. The impound officer asked, "Patrolman, do you have the key to this truck? If so, hand it over right now. This gentleman has court authorization to remove a tape recorder from this vehicle." The officer reluctantly handed the key to Steve and started to walk away. Before he could leave, the impound officer caught him and demanded to see his identification. The officer handed it over reluctantly, then left in a hurry. Steve found the tape recorder and sighed in relief when he discovered it still had the tape inside and was in good condition. He didn't listen to the whole tape, but what he heard seemed to match what Jeff had told him. Steve thanked the officer and got the name of the officer who had tried to open the truck without authorization. When court resumed, the judge called the attorneys to the bench and asked, "Well, did you obtain the information we needed during the recess?" The prosecutor said, "Yes, Your Honor. Here is a copy of the restraining order. As you can see, it was filed shortly after 4 p.m. yesterday. Clearly, Mr. Fielding was in violation of this order when he was at his former residence." The judge looked at the order and then turned to the prosecutor with a sarcastic tone. "I wonder how an order can be filed at 4:20 in the recorder's office, several miles from the accused's residence, then driven across town in less than 30 minutes to be served. I also noticed that the officer serving the order was the first patrol car on the scene and stopped the truck at the end of the block, making the arrest. Apparently, Mr. Fielding was never formally served the restraining order. Isn't it strange that you are trying to prosecute Mr. Fielding for violating an order he had yet to see, one that wasn't even filed until after he began removing his belongings from his residence?" The prosecutor looked sick and spluttered as the judge finished his statement. The judge turned to Steve and said, "Counselor, I hope you have better documentation for your side of the case than the honorable prosecutor does." Steve said, "I think so, Your Honor, but I don't have all the evidence I should have. In fact, I'm lucky I have any evidence at all." He then explained what he found at the police station's property room and described arriving at the impound yard just as an officer was trying to open the truck door. When the judge learned that an officer had unauthorized access to the key and was trying to use it, he grew angry. "Your Honor, I haven't listened to the entire tape, but I know it was operating. Shall we listen together?" With a nod from the judge, Steve pressed play. There was silence in the courtroom as the tape played. The longer it went on, the more upset Howard and Amy looked. They stood to leave, and as they walked out, Howard glared at Jeff. After the tape ended, the judge thought for a moment and then banged his gavel down. "Case dismissed. Mr. Fielding and Mr. Fielding, you are free to go. I trust you won't violate the restraining order now that you know about it." Jeff and Joe followed Steve out of the courtroom. Their first stop was the property room. Then they moved on to the impound yard to pick up their truck for the 2-hour drive home. Steve followed them to the cabin and had a drink with them while they discussed the day's events. Joe went home and Jeff and Steve continued to talk. Jeff said, "Mr. Jensen, I don't know what my grandfather is planning to do to help me, but I want that man ruined. I want his reputation destroyed, and if possible, I want his business closed. I also want my conniving wife to face the consequences. Can we do that legally, or will I have to do something else?" Steve replied, "First off, call me Steve. Secondly, don't go off half-cocked now. We just got you out of one mess. Calm down and let your grandfather and me work on this. I don't know exactly what your grandfather has in mind, but if I know him, he's not going to hit that guy with a sledgehammer. He's going to use an atomic bomb. He said he'd talk to you in a day or two about things. So just wait, okay?" Jeff decided to take a few days off, relaxing and arranging his belongings in the cabin. He turned the second bedroom into an office and set up his personal items around the place. He replaced some furniture with his own but kept most of the resort's furnishings. Jeff saw Abigail several times a day and began to get to know her. She still brought him coffee in the mornings and either cooked his breakfast in the cabin or brought leftovers from the main lodge. Jeff told her she didn't have to, but she would laugh and say, "I never saw a man who could cook worth a darn, and my daddy always said breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Your grandma told me to look out for you, and I'm going to do that." Unless she was busy, Abigail would eat breakfast with Jeff, and he grew to enjoy her company. One evening, he was sitting on the deck watching the sunset and drinking some Glenlivet when Abby came down the trail from the main lodge, carrying a towel and cooler and wearing a conservative two-piece swimsuit. When Abigail saw Jeff, she stopped to chat. After a few minutes, she climbed up on the deck to sit with him. Eventually, she said, "If I'm going to get my swim in before dark, I really have to go. I'll see you in the morning." As she started to leave, she turned back and said, "Hey, come on with me and swim a while. It's way too hot to just sit there drinking. Besides, you've been drinking too much. You need to work some of it out of your system." Jeff refused, even when Abigail pleaded with him. Finally, she came back up on the deck and sat down beside him. She opened her cooler, took out a black cherry wine cooler, and drank. They sat in silence for a short time before Jeff looked over at her and said, "I thought you were going to swim. Why are you sitting here?" Abby replied, "Well, I don't like to swim alone, and it's not good to drink alone. Since you won't come with me, I'll just have to sit here and melt while we drink the evening away." Jeff watched her for a moment, then said, "Okay. If you're going to be like that, I guess I'll go with you. Let me get my suit." Abby grinned as she watched him walk unsteadily into the cabin. She thought she heard him fall while dressing but didn't check. After they cooled off in the water, Jeff lay back on a beach towel and Abby joined him. They talked and watched the night fall when Jeff asked, "Abby, I know it's none of my business, but why are you here? I've heard you say your folks moved and left you, but why didn't you go with them? And why aren't you going to college? You're intelligent, and yet you're working here." Abby's eyes teared up, and she turned to Jeff. "Mr. Fielding, it's none of your business why my parents moved and I stayed here. And if you can't drop it, find someone else to swim with. For your information, I am going to college. I take 1 or 2 courses a semester and do well in them. I'd like to take more, but that's all I can afford. I have 27 semester hours completed. It'll take time, but I will get my degree. I'm studying hotel and restaurant management so I can run a place like this. Now, are we going to talk about something else, or am I going to leave?" After she said that, Abby stood and began gathering her belongings. Jeff scrambled up, grabbed her by the arms, and looked into her eyes. "Abby, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you or hurt your feelings. I just wanted to know more about you." "If you don't want to talk about it, we won't," Jeff said gently. "But if you need help, I'm here for you." When he grabbed her, Abigail tensed and tried to pull away. Realizing she couldn't, she stood still and glared at him. Jeff held his ground, and finally, Abby sighed and relaxed. "I'm sorry I overreacted, Jeff," she said. "I just don't like thinking about it. You see, I love this place and couldn't bear to leave it. My parents owned it but couldn't make a living from it. When your grandfather offered to buy it, my dad jumped at the chance and moved to Kansas City. I refused to go. Since I was over 18, they couldn't make me. It's hard making my own way, but I don't intend to leave this place if I can help it. Your grandfather lets me stay in a little room in the lodge as part of my pay, and I get to eat from the lodge table, so I get by. I just get so angry at my dad for leaving all this behind." Jeff pulled Abby into his arms to comfort her. She nestled her head under his chin, pressing her cheek to his chest. He could feel her tears. Jeff sighed, realizing how good it felt to hold a woman again. He placed a gentle kiss on the top of her head. "Abby, I know exactly what you mean. I planned to move back here to Steelville when I finished college. I fell madly in love with my wife before I graduated, and we were to marry after we both got our degrees. Before the wedding, we talked about where to live, and Amy flat out refused to move back here. She told me it was either her or Steelville, and I chose her. I managed to get her to live in Springville so I could come home frequently, but she refused to come with me most of the time. She hates small towns and rural areas with a passion. I wish now I had chosen Steelville. I feel myself relaxing every time I turn down the road toward home in this resort. If I ever marry again, I will never marry someone who won't live here with me. It's part of my soul. It's where I belong and where I intend to raise any children I might have." Abby looked up at Jeff and smiled. She wiped the tears from her eyes, then stood on her tiptoes and gave him a quick peck on the lips. "Oh, Jeff, I think you love this place as much as I do. If anyone had to buy it, I'm glad it was your grandfather. At least the land is back in your family, and I can tell your whole family loves it." Jeff took her hands in his. "Yeah, maybe I do. I know I've never been anywhere that makes me feel like this place does. I've never been with anyone who understands how my family and I feel about it either. I wish I had met someone like you before I met Amy." Abby smiled and said, "Thank you, Jeff. That's nice. Now I better get back to my room. I have some work to do and it's getting late. I'll be down for breakfast unless you'd rather come up to the lodge." "No, please come down. I like having breakfast here with you better than at the lodge. It seems more relaxed here on the deck." After Abby left, Jeff sat back down on the deck. It was still too early to go to bed, and he didn't feel like watching TV. Many nights he would read a book or surf the net, but those pastimes held no appeal tonight. He listened to the happy tinkle of the stream running past the yard and over the rocks while he thought about the difference between Amy and Abigail. Somehow, he could never picture Amy here, but more and more he could picture Abby curled up with him as they enjoyed the quiet evenings by the stream. He leaned back in the chair and watched the stars, feeling the tension drain from his body and soul. Jeff woke the next morning to peals of laughter and the sun on his face. He felt stiff and had to pee badly. He was confused before realizing where he was. He had fallen asleep on the deck chair and hadn't woken up all night. Abby stood in the doorway watching him struggle to wake up and laughing. "What's the matter, lazy bones?" she teased. "Couldn't you even make it to your own bed last night? I knew I should have taken care of you before I left." By the time she finished scolding, Abby stood with an amused look and her fists on her hips. She backed up to let Jeff through the door, and he gave her a disgruntled look as he passed her, feeling a bit of dampness in his shorts. He heard Abby laughing again as the sound of a stream carried back to the kitchen area. When Abby heard Jeff walk back into the kitchen, she turned and started to hand him a cup of coffee. She froze in shock when she saw his grim expression as he headed straight for her. For a moment, she felt a flash of fear as he grabbed her, but then she exploded in laughter when he began tickling her. She fought back, twisting and turning, trying to escape his tickles until he finally stopped. Jeff held her and looked down at her face. "Let that be a lesson to you. Don't you know it's not nice to make fun of your elders?" Abby tried to be angry, but she couldn't keep the stern expression on her face. She was normally a happy person with a sunny personality. Jeff watched her, and then his head bent closer to hers. Their lips touched, and she moaned, pressing her body against him as they kissed passionately. When they broke apart, Abby blushed and turned away from Jeff. Jeff noticed they were both breathing hard. He gently pulled Abby around to see her face. She covered her face with her hands, but he gently took her wrists and pulled them away to see her eyes. They stood there in silence for several heartbeats. Then Jeff walked toward Abby, pushing her back against the cabinet until she was trapped between his body and the counter. He put his hands on the counter edge, one on each side of Abby, and leaned down to give her another kiss, a gentle, loving one this time. Abby returned the kiss. When Jeff pulled back, she twisted and picked up the coffee cup once more. Abby handed the cup to Jeff and said, "Here, drink your coffee and behave. Do you want your breakfast now, or should we have some coffee first?" Jeff reached past her to pour another cup of coffee. He handed it to her and took her hand, leading her to the deck. They sat watching the sun come up, the warm rays streaming between the trees surrounding the deck and yard. Neither felt the need to talk. They just sat and listened to the cattle lowing in the background and the stream tinkling past the yard. They enjoyed watching the world wake up for another glorious day. The mist hanging in the field across the stream gave the view a peaceful look. Finally, Abby got up and started toward the kitchen. Before she walked off, she said, "I have to get your breakfast and get to work. Your grandfather will fire me if I keep loafing on the job like I have been since you got here." Jeff followed her into the kitchen and walked up behind her, trapping her between himself and the stove. He nuzzled her neck where it met her shoulder, smiling when he heard her gasp and saw her tremble. He placed a gentle kiss there, then pulled back and said, "Oh, I would never let him get rid of you. And you know he wouldn't do that anyway. He told me you could run this place all by yourself already, and he could never replace you if you decided to leave. Besides, what would I do for company if you left me?" Abby felt her stomach warm and a strange sensation spread through her as Jeff nuzzled her neck. What was happening to her? She couldn't let this happen. Jeff was a married man, and besides, he couldn't really be interested in her, could he? No, she had to be misunderstanding things. But why was he kissing her and seeking her out during the day? She smiled and continued cooking their meal, just basking in his presence. She had never felt this way around any other boy or man. It felt good, right? She was content just to be with him, and it felt wonderful when he held or kissed her. Abby hadn't been gone long when Jeff's grandfather walked into the cabin and into Jeff's office. Jeff had been trying to get some work done and was berating himself for letting his personal problems distract him. He hadn't heard his grandfather come in, so he jumped when he spoke. "Jeff, if you've got time, I would like to discuss some of the information you gave me on Harriman Printing and some of the things we have uncovered about Howard and his friends." Jeff felt his stomach lurch and sighed. "I really don't want to think about that mess, but I guess we'd better get it taken care of." Jim sat in one of the large leather chairs tastefully arranged in a corner of the room. He leaned back and put his feet up on the leather footstool before he began to speak. "I finally got word from Homer that he has identified almost all the men Amy has been with since he began his surveillance of her and Howard. There are a few men whose full names we don't have yet, but we know the companies they work for and will soon have all the names. Almost all the men Amy has been with are married, and many of them have children. We have addresses for everyone whose name we know, and much of their personal information, too. Now it's time to make our moves on them. That's what I want to talk to you about. How hard do you want to be on the men involved with Amy? When this happened to me, I went scorched earth, but in retrospect, that wasn't always the best choice." Jeff took a moment, gathering his thoughts. Jim could see the anger reddening his face, his breathing deepening and growing ragged. Jim watched as Jeff struggled to control his emotions before he spoke. "I want to ruin Howard and Amy. I want all the unmarried men to lose their jobs at the very least, and the married ones to be broken, especially the ones we can prove knew Amy was married. I want all the wives to have everything we gather so they can dump their cheating husbands if they want. As far as I'm concerned, they can all be fried. I suggest we turn our information over to law enforcement and their superiors. If it can be proven they gave Harriman larger orders or paid more than competitors' prices for the same documents, they might run afoul of laws or corporate policies." Jim grinned at Jeff. "So far, we are in total agreement. I think if we play this right, we can even add a printing unit to our business. From what you and Homer have found, I believe we can hurt Howard enough that he'll have to either sell the business or go bankrupt. In either case, we can pick it up for pennies on the dollar. I have a tentative plan of attack. It has a fair chance of success, but it could take several months to complete." Jeff smiled. "Time is no issue. The longer we drag it out, the more Howard will suffer. If we play it right, we can maximize his suffering and our profits. I want Howard and his cronies to know I'm the one behind their pain. I want them to suffer and know I'm pulling the strings." Jim nodded. "I have no problem with that, but you need to be careful. I have more experience in these matters and want to help you put the plan into action. We also need to keep Steve in the loop so he can keep us on the right side of the law." The two men talked for a while longer. Then Jim left for lunch. Jeff thought about making a sandwich, then decided to go to the lodge for lunch. It was the end of the lunch period when he walked into the small dining room. Abby looked up from her cleaning in exasperation when she heard footsteps. Her face broke into a sunny smile when she saw Jeff, and she felt her heart flutter. Before she knew it, she was standing beside Jeff's table. Without thinking, she asked, "I didn't expect to see you here. Do you want some lunch, honey?" When she realized what she had said, Abby blushed and bit her lower lip. Jeff smiled. "I thought about making a sandwich at the cabin, but I remembered how good a cook you are and decided to come up here and let you feed me. Maybe we can have lunch together if you have time." Abby's smile widened. "Sure, I haven't had my lunch yet. Why don't we go outside, though? It's so nice out there today. I've been dying to find an excuse to go out." While they were eating, Jeff kept looking at Abby. Finally, she put her glass down and asked, "What?" Jeff seemed startled. "What do you mean? Why do you keep looking at me that way? First you look calm and happy, then your eyes go blank and you seem a million miles away. Have I done something wrong?" Jeff sighed. "I'm sorry, Abby. Grandpa and I have started moving against the men who took my wife from me. I've been thinking about our next moves and what I have to do to get things rolling. A big part of the work will fall to Grandpa because he's friendly with some of the men we need to help us. Even with his help, I still have a lot of work to do to succeed. I hate thinking about how busy I'll be because it means less time for our talks and fishing and swimming trips. But I'm excited about finally getting some revenge." The following Monday, Amy walked into Howard's outer office and sat at her desk. She was exhausted from her weekend business trip and from fighting the divorce settlement. She had about given up trying to talk to Jeffrey. Every time she called him, he hung up on her, and often he wouldn't even answer. Amy was surprised when she realized a few weeks ago that she didn't really miss Jeffrey. All her needs were being met, especially when negotiating deals for Howard. She remembered how she had manipulated Jeff for so long and was sure if she could just get him to talk, he would give her more in the divorce settlement. She was thankful he hadn't caused more trouble. Maybe he was the weakling Howard said he was. Maybe he was afraid to cause a stink because he feared facing his betters. When they were dating and engaged, Amy had thought she truly loved Jeffrey. She wondered now if that had been true. She liked him a lot, and they had so much fun in college that she convinced herself she loved him. She hadn't stopped her wild escapades even while dating him. She grudgingly gave them up after getting engaged and missed them terribly until Janet got her promoted. Sex with Jeff was great, but there was something better and more exciting about the wild, uninhibited sex with different, more powerful men that she craved. The danger of getting caught excited her too. Deep down, Amy admitted to herself she was in it for the money she and Jeff had saved and the thrill she got from her affairs. Amy hadn't even settled into her daily routine when Howard buzzed her on the intercom. "Amy, come in here, please. We need to talk." Amy smiled and told her assistant, Sally, that she'd be in Howard's office and to hold all calls. Sally looked up and said, "Yeah, I bet he needs to talk. He's probably horny after a weekend without and needs you to relieve some pressure. I swear I don't think his wife ever takes care of him as randy as he is here in the office. Call me if you need any help." Amy walked toward Howard's door, adding an extra swing to her hips. Just before she opened it, she looked at Sally and said, "Oh, I don't think I'll need any help this time. After all, there's only one man in there." Her eyes were glistening and her breathing had picked up by the time she was behind Howard's closed door. She started to unbutton her blouse, but Howard stopped her. "Don't do that. We have some serious stuff to work on this morning. Do you know who Jim Fielding, Paul, or Edward Fielding are?" Amy sat down, puzzled. "Yes, I do. Jim Fielding is Jeffrey's grandfather, Paul is his father, and Edward is his uncle. Why?" Howard looked pale and unwell. "I was playing golf this weekend with Stuart Ross, and he told me this order we are printing for them now will be the last one we get. I asked why, and he said because he was given a choice of either doing business with us or doing business with Jim Fielding and his companies. This morning, I got a call from Rollins Manufacturing canceling their order and telling me not to call on them again. When I asked why, David Rollins said, 'I was fishing this weekend with Paul and Edward Fielding and found out some things I didn't like about your business practices. I've seen some DVDs of you and your assistant negotiating with my purchasing manager, and I don't like your methods. I fired my purchasing manager and his assistant for giving you the contract. I understand the prosecutor is looking into their actions this week. Also, 2 faxes canceling orders came in this morning. I called Joe Randall when I got his and asked why he was canceling. He said, "Howard, I know better than to cross those Fieldings and Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. I don't know what you did to get on their bad side, but if I were you, I would patch things up with them as soon as you can, or your business is history. They have a real hard-on for you, and let me know in no uncertain terms that if I kept doing business with you, I wouldn't be doing it with them. Hell, they are almost 13% of my receivables, and they own 43% of my business." I asked him why he was so worried about a pissant hick in his farm store. He laughed and said, "Either you're as ignorant as they come, or too stupid to know what side of the bread the butter's on. Steelville Feed and Farm is Missouri's Berkshire Hathaway, and Jim Fielding is their Warren Buffett. I'd rather cross my wife and her entire family than mess with them." Amy felt her stomach sink. She lowered her head as Howard described the storm brewing around them. Her stomach churned, and she began shaking. When she raised her head to look at Howard, he was glaring at her, his jaw set and face white. He raised his voice and almost shouted, "You damn little witch! Why didn't you tell me that pissant you were married to had this much power? I started to wonder when he beat our first try to get him with the police. Then I was really curious when he didn't even seem to notice our other attempts to ruin him after he went back to that hick town. Now I see why. It was like I was a mosquito biting an elephant. He didn't even feel it. Amy, you need to find another job. I can't afford to have you around any longer. I hope I can get rid of you fast enough to get this heat off my back. If you'd kept your legs together, we wouldn't be in this mess. Now get out!" Howard turned his attention back to the papers on his desk. Amy stood there, tears welling up in her eyes. "Howard, I'm sorry. I just didn't know. They all live like they barely have enough to get by. They never party or take extravagant trips. It's like they have to watch every penny. They live in that little hick town in those little houses. If they have that kind of money, why don't they show it and use it?" Howard sighed and looked back up at Amy. "Do you know who Warren Buffett is?" Amy nodded. "He lives in the same house he bought in the early 1960s, and he is one of the world's richest men. Did you ever bother to find out what Jeff and his family were worth? Or did you just dismiss them because they lived in the country and had small, older homes?" Amy's heart sank even further as she realized Howard was right. She had assumed that since Jeffrey came from the country and his family lived in the country, they were poor. When she found out about the store, she thought they were just making a good living for the small town of Steelville. Now she realized what she had thrown away in search of excitement and wealth. If she had stayed faithful to Jeffrey and played her cards right, she would have had everything she wanted. She started crying and turned to leave Howard's office. When she reached for the door, Howard said, "Before you leave, send in my new administrative assistant." Amy walked out the door and closed it behind her. Sally rushed over and wrapped her arm around Amy. "What's wrong, Amy?" "Jeffrey and his family are causing trouble for Howard. He fired me this morning. I had no idea Jeff was so rich. Howard asked me to send in his new administrative assistant just before I left the office. Sally, honey, I know how exciting this life and the travel is, but if you want to keep your husband, you better quit and get as far away from Howard as you can. I don't know all that's going on, but if Jeff and his family are causing trouble, you could get caught in it too. I just hope it's not too late for you." Amy spent the rest of the day miserable. All she could do was sit at home and cry, wondering how things had gone so wrong. All she had ever wanted was an exciting life and the glamour of the big city. She had grown up in a small town in Indiana and swore she would never get trapped in one again. Her whole life was a battle to get more money and meet rich, important people so she could rise above the boredom of small towns. She had finally had it all within her grasp when Jeff and his family threw a wrench into the mix. Amy seethed as she thought about Jeff. How dare he thwart her attempts to rise to the top? She knew now she had made a serious error in marrying him, but at the time, he had seemed like a rising star. He was a teaching assistant at Wharton School of Business, for God's sake. He graduated magna cum laude. He could have had his choice of jobs and lived in any large city. How was she to know he preferred a simpler life? Amy was wallowing in self-pity when her phone rang. She let the call go to the machine but picked up when she recognized her mother's voice. As soon as she did, she regretted it. "Amy, how could you?" her mother screeched. You had the perfect man, and you turned into a little hooker, screwing around until he caught you and dumped you. My God! You know your father and I aren't prudes. You know we watch porn because I remember catching you and your brothers watching one of our movies when you were younger. But never in my life have I seen some of the things I saw you do on this DVD. Amy's mother scolded her over the phone. Your father and I heard rumors about your behavior in college, but we never thought you could do something like this. How could you do that to such a wonderful husband? Amy tried to respond, but her mother hung up. She dropped the phone and burst into tears. The phone rang repeatedly for the rest of the evening, but Amy let the calls go to voicemail. All but one were from friends and family who had received a copy of the DVD. The exception was from a furious former lover who had lost his job and wife because of the scandal. You damn little witch! I've lost everything because of you and your boss. If I ever see you again, I might just knock your teeth out. Tell your boss I'm coming for him. The next few weeks were a blur for Amy. With no job, her expenses quickly ate through her savings. She cut all unnecessary costs, canceled memberships, and made only the minimum payments on her credit cards. But it wasn't enough. She sent out over 200 resumes and had 3 job interviews, but none led to employment. Worse, one interview was canceled when the hiring manager learned about her involvement in the scandal. He had said, "Miss Fielding, this company doesn't operate the way you do. We want nothing to do with someone who thinks it's good business to sleep their way to the top. We had to fire a good friend because of you and your boss's practices. We don't want anyone like that here." Finally, the day of her divorce hearing arrived. Amy didn't want to attend, but her attorney insisted. During the procedure, she found herself staring at Jeff. He looked more powerful and commanding than ever. Despite her attorney's efforts, they couldn't break the prenuptial agreement. The judge was unsympathetic, especially when Jeff's attorney presented a letter Amy had written demanding the prenuptial agreement as a condition of their marriage. Realizing the futility, Amy instructed her attorney to accept the terms Jeff outlined. She just wanted it to be over. She had made her bed and now had to lie in it. With the house no longer hers, Amy spent the rest of the week packing and searching for a new place to live. She was thankful for the bonus money she had hidden, but it was dwindling fast. If she was careful, she could live off it for about 3 years. Investing it might make it last longer, but she feared the IRS discovering she hadn't reported it. Her parents refused to let her move back home, and her father harshly called her a hooker. She hoped her sister might let her stay in her college apartment, but her sister was afraid their father would stop paying her rent if he found out. On Monday evening, after the divorce was finalized, Amy was browsing job listings online when the doorbell rang. Looking out the window, she saw Sally leaning on the front door, crying. Amy rushed to open it just as Sally was about to leave. "Sally, what's the matter?" she asked. Sally turned to her, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Amy, you were right. I did one more sales call with Howard, and then I told him I was going to quit. I told him I was afraid to keep working like this with Jeff and his family causing trouble. I told him the sex and extra money weren't worth risking my marriage. He got angry and said he needed me to help rebuild the business. But I didn't go back to work the next day, and it was too late. I got served with divorce papers for adultery. I talked to Darren before he left, and he said it was Jeffrey who told him. At least we didn't have a prenuptial agreement like you did, so I'll get some of our assets. Oh, Amy, what am I going to do? I love Darren so much. I'm sorry I let you talk me into this. You made it seem so exciting, and the money would have helped a lot. I had some great times, but I always felt guilty. Now I've lost Darren. How could I have been so stupid?" Amy invited Sally to stay the night, and after dinner she called Janet to come over. The 3 women drank wine and shared their troubles. They came up with a plan. They had some of the bonus money Howard had given them, and Janet had managed to keep her house and some assets after her divorce. Janet agreed to let Amy and Sally live with her and share the expenses. Janet made it clear that they would split all costs equally, including the house payment, which would be considered rent. Janet was the only one still working. She had left Harriman Printing and found a poorly paid job before the rumors started. Her boss had asked about Howard and her work there, and she explained she had left after an indiscretion. He warned her not to bring any trouble to the new company, but kept her on because she was a good worker. The 3 women stayed in touch with friends still working for Howard. They learned that Howard's business was failing. His wife had divorced him and taken almost all their investments and the house. Jim and Jeff targeted companies with employees who had been involved with Amy, causing many men to lose their jobs and their companies to stop doing business with Howard. Most of these men's wives divorced them and took them to the cleaners. Howard struggled to keep his business afloat. He had to lay off most of his staff and was barely printing enough to pay the bills. He sold his country club membership and cut personal expenses. One Monday morning, his banker called to give him a heads up that they would start foreclosure proceedings if he didn't catch up on his loan payments within a week. Despite trying to find other financing, Howard couldn't secure any loans. By the end of the week, Howard was a broken man. The following Monday, an attorney came to his office with foreclosure papers, informing him that the bank was planning to place him in involuntary bankruptcy. Howard sat in disbelief, his head in his hands. He couldn't fathom that Jeffrey was so upset over his wife that he would go to such lengths. He was in disbelief that someone could ruin him so quickly. He had always been able to make people do his bidding with threats or demands. Many of the husbands of the women he manipulated knew about their affairs, but stayed quiet because they feared his threats of ruining them. Howard opened his top desk drawer and looked at the pistol inside. It would be so easy to end it all, but no, he had to take care of Jeffrey and his family first. He locked his office and left the building, feeling his business slipping away day by day. One afternoon, he received a call from a business broker. They got straight to the point. A business had heard about his troubles and might be interested in buying his printing business for the right price. Howard initially wanted to refuse, but decided to hear the offer. He was surprised by how generous it was. Without much thought, it seemed the offer would pay off all his loans and leave him with about $250,000 in cash. They made it clear he had to sign the contract immediately and agree never to compete in the printing business again. Howard told them to send the contract for review. He was so happy he treated himself to a luxurious meal, reminiscing about the times he wined and dined customers and suppliers with his administrative assistants. The contract arrived the next day by registered mail. Howard made another critical mistake. He didn't have an attorney review it. His usual law firm had stopped working with him, and he didn't want to waste time finding another. He read the contract and chuckled as he signed it, thinking he could start over in another business and be successful again soon. He should have read the fine print, which stated that any remaining balance after satisfying his debts would be given to him as a certified check. The day of the closing was bright and sunny, which Howard took as a good omen. The meeting was in his bank's main office, where the bank would receive their share of the purchase price to clear his loans, and then he would get his check. Howard was escorted into the meeting room, where he saw 5 men at the table: his banker, a court officer, the bank's attorney, and 2 representatives from the purchasing company. One was an attorney, and the other was the chairman of the board. Howard felt he recognized the attorney but couldn't place him. Everything was businesslike. Howard signed the necessary documents, and the banker and attorneys reviewed them. The banker then pointed out that the vice president of operations, acquisitions, and research for Steelville Feed and Farm Supply hadn't signed one of the pages. Howard became upset and demanded an explanation. The banker calmly replied, "What do you mean by that? They are the ones who bought your business, Howard." Howard was stunned. "No, they didn't. I agreed to sell to Western Missouri Printing. What's going on here?" The familiar-looking attorney smiled and said, "I'm sorry for the confusion. You did sell to Western Missouri Printing, but they are a wholly owned subsidiary of Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. So, Mr. Jeffrey Fielding, the Vice President of Operations, Acquisitions, and Research, needs to sign off on the purchase along with the signatures from our printing division. Don't worry, he just stepped out for a moment. I'll call him back in," the attorney said. While Steve was calling Jeff back into the room, Howard fumed. "Bullshit! The deal is off. I'm not letting that little pissant take my business." He reached for the documents, but the banker's attorney picked them up first. "Howard, you've already signed these documents. That makes them a valid contract unless the purchaser decides not to sign. The only way this deal can be stopped is by mutual agreement or a failure of a party to sign." Just then, Jeffrey walked into the room. "Sorry I wasn't here for the signing. I had to take a restroom break and got a call. Let me sign, and we can finish this business." After Jeffrey signed, the attorneys reviewed the papers one last time and distributed copies to everyone involved. The checks, already prepared, were handed to the banker for Harriman Printing, and everyone started packing up their briefcases. After the bank received their check and withdrew the involuntary bankruptcy petition, Howard sat there fuming, waiting for his money. Finally, Howard spoke up. "Excuse me, gentlemen, but aren't you forgetting something?" The chairman of Western Missouri Printing looked around and asked, "No, I don't think so. Steve, Mr. Fielding, did we miss anything?" The attorney shook his head, continuing to pack up. Howard, now very angry, shouted, "You haven't paid me yet! I was supposed to get about $250,000 after the loans were paid off." The chairman replied, "Oh, right. The balance left was $247,563.79. Here's the receipt for its disbursement. I'm sorry, we forgot to give that to you." Howard's face twisted in confusion and anger. "Disbursement? What the hell do you mean disbursement? That money was supposed to come to me." The attorney explained, "You must have forgotten the lien against your assets in your divorce decree. You were required to pay your ex-wife a percentage of the gross sale price if you sold the business during her lifetime. After expenses, what you had left didn't cover that amount. You'll need to arrange payment for the balance with her and her attorney." As Howard walked toward the door, Jeff entered again. Howard's face turned red with rage. "You little pissant! What are you doing here again?" Jeff smiled. "Oh, good, you're still here, Howie. I forgot to tell you that we have men here to escort you to your old office to gather your personal belongings. Sorry for the oversight." Howard stood there, shaking with anger. He couldn't believe this little pissant was the vice president of operations, acquisitions, and research of the company that had just ruined him. He muttered, "You son of a bitch," and stalked out the door. In the corridor, a uniformed guard approached him. The guard's patch read, "State Security Service, a division of Steelville Feed and Farm Supply." The guard said, "Mr. Harriman, I'm here to escort you to your former office to collect any personal items you have remaining. Shall we go?" Defeated, Howard nodded and began walking. The guard followed. When they got to the garage, the guard got into Howard's car. "I'll ride with you to ensure you can get back into the building. My people will follow in our van." Inside his building, another guard stood by the door. Howard's receptionist wouldn't even look at him as he was escorted to his former office. He walked through the door and stopped dead in his tracks. Jeffrey Fielding was sitting in a guest chair, talking to a well-dressed woman seated behind Howard's desk. Howard felt his face redden with anger. "What the hell are you doing in my office?" he shouted. Jeffrey looked at Howard calmly. "First of all, Howie, this is no longer your office. Secondly, I own this company now, so I can sit wherever I want. Thirdly, I was discussing continuing operations with Mrs. Hartshorn, the president of our printing division, while we wait for the new plant manager. Not that it's any of your business." Jeff turned to Mrs. Hartshorn and said, "Perhaps we should take a break while Mr. Harriman cleans out this office. We've covered everything we need to talk about today anyway." A few days later, Howard was sitting on his patio cleaning his pistol when one of his few remaining friends walked up. Watching Howard for a moment, his friend said, "Howard, I've heard you've been spending a lot of time at the ranch. I saw you hitting the target 7 out of 10 times this morning. That's pretty good, but not good enough. Howard, if you're planning what I think you are, you need to change your mind." Howard looked at his friend and said, "I don't know what you mean, Jack. I just don't have much to do now that my company is gone, so I took up target shooting. Is that a crime?" Jack replied, "No, it's not. But if you're thinking of revenge, you should know something about the Fieldings. Jim Fielding is a retired Army Ranger Lieutenant Colonel. Paul Fielding is a retired Green Beret Colonel. Jeffrey Fielding was a Green Beret captain before he left the Army, and he's still in the reserves. Almost every male in the Fielding family is prior service, and many of their employees are retired or former military. Even if you get 1 or 2 of them, they'll get you. I think you should let it go and start over somewhere else." Howard sat in shock as Jack's words sank in. He sighed and said, "Yeah, sounds like good advice." The next day, Howard packed up what little he had left and headed for the Pacific Northwest. He arrived in Portland, Oregon with all his possessions in his car and a burning hatred for the Fielding family. Sitting in a cheap hotel bar, he was reading the want ads when another guest sat beside him. The dowdy-looking man glanced at the job offers Howard had circled and said, "Tough times. I've been looking for work for 3 weeks myself. What's your story? Housing bubble get you? Or was it the banking meltdown?" Howard felt talkative that afternoon, so he told a modified version of his story. He ended by saying, "In short, I had everything I ever wanted. A wife to take care of the house, a business that made me a ton of money, and every 2 years I found another stupid woman to screw and party with. My customers loved the perks and got a kick out of screwing married women and embarrassing their husbands. But I screwed up. I messed with the wrong woman, and her ex-husband and his family screwed me over. They had more clout, and I couldn't beat them. My wife divorced me and took almost everything. Then those damn Fieldings took my business and merged it into theirs. The attorneys say it was all legal. Now here I am, trying to start over at 56. His new friend shook his head. "Tough luck. We're sort of in the same boat. My wife caught me cheating and cleaned me out too. Well, guess I'll catch you later." After the divorce, Jeffrey returned to Steelville and resumed his work. The only bright spots in his life now were Abigail and his successful revenge against Howard. He had won, but it felt like he had lost in the process. He wasn't sorry to leave Springville, but he missed what he thought he and Amy had. He had no intention of ever getting back with her, but he missed the companionship and love he thought they had before everything went wrong. Jeff was sitting at his desk when Abigail walked in. She saw his dejected posture and the lost look in his eyes, and her heart swelled with compassion. She didn't understand why she had let herself get this close to anyone before, but something was different this time. Abby also didn't understand why Jeff couldn't just snap out of it. It had been a year since his problems began. He was divorced, had taken down the man who caused his divorce, and had added an excellent company to their conglomerate. From what Abby had heard, the Harriman printing division of Western Missouri Printing was already boosting the company's profits significantly. They even rehired all the employees Mr. Harriman had laid off, except for his assistants. Abby wasn't supposed to know about Steelville Feed and Farm Supply's portfolio, but since she cleaned and cooked for Jeff, she sometimes saw documents he left open on his desk or his computer screen. She was surprised by what she discovered. She had no idea she worked for such a large company until she began taking care of Jeff. As far as she knew, no one in Steelville knew how wealthy the Fieldings were either. Without thinking, Abby walked up and put her hands on Jeff's shoulders. Leaning down slightly, she said, "Jeff, you've been staring at that screen for 5 minutes now. It's after 6 p.m. Why don't you quit? We could go for a nice swim if you hurry. After that, I can make you supper if you want." Jeff turned to Abby and smiled. "That's the best idea I've had all afternoon. I can't seem to concentrate anyway, so let's go." Abby giggled, pulled her shirt over her head, and pushed her shorts down, revealing a beautiful red bikini. "I'm ready. What's taking you so long?" she asked. Abby giggled and ran from the room as Jeff yelled and reached for her. "Last one in has to clean the kitchen after supper," she called as she ran to the swimming hole. Jeff dove into the water, feeling refreshed. He realized that life might not be all happiness for him, but it still offered hope. And that hope was named Abigail. What happened to Amy, you ask? She moved to a big city in the north and now works as an office assistant. As for Howard, after months of trying to find a job, he finally used his pistol. He was found with a single piece of lead in his head. Thanks for listening to One Infidelity Hit. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop us a like.